On a cold, bitter night, Jack Thompson's truck rumbled down the desolate highway, its headlights slicing through the thick veil of snow that had begun to fall heavily. The road ahead stretched endlessly, framed by bare trees, their limbs weighed down by the heavy blanket of snow. Jack, a seasoned truck driver in his late 50s, knew this route like the back of his hand. He had driven it countless times, across miles and miles of empty, frozen landscapes. It was a life that had become routine for him, lonely, quiet, and, at times, distant from the world he used to know. Jack didn't have much left in his life. Or at least that's how it felt. His family had long since faded away, and his friends were either too far or too caught up in their own lives. He'd found solace in the hum of the engine, the rhythm of the wheels spinning across the road. That was enough for him. Or so he told himself. He wasn't one to dwell on emotions or deal with people much. The highway had a way of keeping him at arm's length from the world. A perfect separation for someone who was better off alone. The snowstorm that had started earlier in the evening had worsened as he neared his next stop, a small, aging truck stop along an isolated stretch of the interstate. The only sign of life here was the flickering neon light of the gas pump and the dimly lit diner that looked like it hadn't been renovated in decades. Jack pulled in, parking his massive truck by the pumps. The wind howled outside, making the cold feel even more biting as it swept through the parking lot, carrying with it a promise of more snow to come. He shut off the engine and stretched his stiff muscles, the familiar creak of his bones reminding him that getting older wasn't for the faint of heart. He stepped out into the frigid air, closing the truck door behind him. The icy wind immediately cut through his jacket, sending shivers down his spine. With a low grunt, Jack made his way over to the pump, his boots crunching in the thick layer of snow that had already accumulated on the ground. The station seemed eerily quiet. No other trucks in sight. No other drivers milling around. Just the hum of the old fluorescent lights above. Jack paid little attention to the silence. He was used to it. He wasn't here for company. As he filled the tank, Jack's eyes were drawn to something unusual. At the edge of the parking lot, near a broken wooden fence, a small shape moved in the swirling snow. He squinted, trying to make sense of it. It was a dog, no, a puppy, small and white with patches of golden fur, struggling against the storm. The poor thing was drenched, its coat already covered in snow, its tiny legs barely able to keep up with the force of the wind. Jack's first instinct was to ignore it. It wasn't his problem. The puppy was someone else's responsibility, probably a stray that had wandered off or been abandoned. But something about it stopped him. The dog wasn't just wandering aimlessly. It was heading straight for him, its eyes wide and full of desperation. Jack felt a pang of something deep in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had seen his share of stray animals in his time on the road. Most of them were either too wild or too frightened to approach anyone. This little one, however, seemed different. There was an odd sense of urgency in its movements, a quiet plea in its eyes. The puppy reached him, its tiny body shaking with cold. It paused, as if unsure what to do next, before it gingerly opened its mouth and dropped something at Jack's feet. A small, tattered black bag, ripped at the seams, with a faint, almost unnoticeable odor of something foul wafting from it. Jack bent down, his hands instinctively reaching for it. Before he could stop himself, his fingers brushed against the bag's rough surface, the cold metal of its clasp biting into his skin. "What's this?" Jack muttered to himself, though the puppy didn't seem to have any answer. It was still staring up at him with those imploring eyes, its tail wagging weakly despite the storm. He should have walked away. He should have gotten back in his truck, driven off, and left this mess behind him. But instead, Jack stood there, holding the bag, wondering what could possibly be inside. It wasn't just the puppy's odd behavior that had drawn him in. It was the feeling that there was something more to this moment than he could explain. Something about the way the puppy had appeared out of nowhere, and the way it had been so determined to find him. It all felt too strange to ignore. With a reluctant sigh, Jack bent down and gently scooped the dog into his arms. It was surprisingly light for how soaked it was. Its fur soft and matted with snow. He felt a strange connection to it, as if it was something from his past. Or maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on him. He turned and headed back toward his truck. The puppy nestled against his chest, still trembling. Inside the warmth of the truck cab, Jack sat the dog on the passenger seat, fumbling with the bag. The little creature watched him intently, its gaze never leaving him, as if waiting for him to do something. As Jack tried to open the bag, he noticed something strange. There was no obvious way to open it. No zipper, no button, just the torn edges that seemed to lead nowhere. He frowned, feeling a deep sense of unease building in his gut. "Come on, what's this all about?" Jack muttered under his breath. He looked down at the puppy, who still hadn't made a sound, its eyes wide and knowing. It was as if it understood something Jack couldn't comprehend. Then, just as he tugged the bag open, a sharp, almost electrical crackle of air filled the truck, and the bag seemed to shift. A strange, faint glow flickered from inside, just enough to cast a ghostly light across the interior. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he peered inside. What lay in the bag was not what he had expected. It wasn't just a collection of random items or discarded junk. It was a small object, wrapped in a cloth, though Jack could not tell what it was. Something heavy, something important. The air in the truck felt charged now, as if whatever this was, whatever this puppy had brought him, was not meant to be found. Not meant to be touched. But the puppy, still staring at him, gave no sign of fear. It simply watched, its gaze unwavering, as if telling Jack that this moment was no accident. It was all part of something far larger than he could possibly imagine. Something he wasn't meant to understand, at least. Not yet. Jack Thompson had never been the superstitious type. He had seen a lot in his life, and most of it didn't make sense. But as the storm raged outside, and the quiet weight of the mysterious bag filled the truck, Jack realized something. This night was different. This night had begun like any other. But it was far from the ordinary. The puppy, the bag, the feeling in the air, it was as though fate itself had pulled him off his familiar road and placed him on a path he could never have predicted. And as much as Jack wanted to walk away from it, he knew deep down that there was no going back now. The snowstorm outside had become a full-blown blizzard. The kind of storm that made even the toughest truckers second-guess their decision to stay on the road. Jack Thompson wasn't the type to back down from a challenge. But something about the relentless winds and the swirling snow made him uneasy. He stood in the truck stop for a few moments, watching the fury of the storm through the windshield. The wind battering the sides of his rig with a force that made the whole vehicle shudder. The night had taken a strange turn. And it wasn't just the weather. The little puppy was still sitting in the passenger seat, its small body trembling, though Jack could tell it wasn't just from the cold. The dog had been quiet for the most part, its golden eyes fixed on him as if waiting for him to make a decision. Jack had never planned to take the dog with him. He wasn't a pet person, not anymore. He wasn't even sure he wanted the responsibility. He was already carrying enough burdens on his own. And the last thing he needed was to complicate things further. But there was something about the dog. Something about the way it had appeared at that exact moment. Out of nowhere, carrying the torn bag in its mouth. The way it hadn't left him alone. Even when he tried to ignore it. It had a look in its eyes. A pleading look that Jack couldn't quite shake off. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the isolation. Or maybe it was just that strange sense of connection that had formed between them in such a short time. Whatever it was, Jack couldn't bring himself to just drive away and leave the dog out in the freezing cold. With a heavy sigh, Jack opened the door to the cab and let the dog climb in. He watched as the puppy scrambled up onto the passenger seat, its tiny legs struggling against the snow that had built up on the truck floor. The dog made itself comfortable, curling up into a small, trembling ball. Jack pulled the door shut behind it and started the truck, the engine rumbling to life, the warmth inside the cabin a stark contrast to the howling winds outside. Jack didn't know what to think. He wasn't sure why he'd made the decision to keep the dog. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was just the odd feeling he had that there was more to this little creature than met the eye. He tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind as the truck crawled forward through the storm. The road was nearly invisible now, swallowed up by the heavy snowfall. The truck's headlights barely cut through the snow, casting weak beams of light that seemed to disappear as soon as they touched the road. Jack kept his eyes on the path ahead, his grip tight on the steering wheel. The weather was relentless, and he had to stay focused. But every now and then, he glanced at the puppy, whose eyes remained fixed on him, its body still trembling. The little dog seemed to be holding something in its mouth, the torn black bag still clutched between its teeth. Jack noticed this again, and it struck him as odd. Why hadn't the dog let go of it? It had been hours since they'd first met, and the bag was still there, as if the dog was guarding it, or maybe, as if it was waiting for Jack to open it. Curiosity gnawed at Jack, but he wasn't sure he wanted to deal with whatever was inside. He'd already gotten more involved than he'd intended, and he didn't like the feeling. But as the truck rumbled down the snow-covered highway, the temptation to see what was inside the bag became too much to ignore. He reached over and carefully pried the bag from the dog's mouth. The puppy didn't resist, but Jack could feel its eyes on him, watching intently. The bag was heavy, and its edges were torn in places, but it was still intact enough to hold whatever was inside. Jack sat there for a moment, his fingers tracing the rough fabric of the bag, before he finally unfastened the clasp and opened it. Inside, he found a few unexpected items. First, there was a photograph, folded in half and slightly faded by time. Jack pulled it out carefully and unfolded it. The photo showed a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, smiling brightly at the camera. She had dark hair tied into pigtails, and her eyes sparkled with innocence. Jack stared at the picture for a long time, his mind racing. Who was she? Was she connected to the dog? Was she somehow linked to the mysterious bag? There was something about the photograph that unsettled Jack. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a sadness in her eyes, something that seemed out of place for a child that young. It was as if she knew something she wasn't supposed to know. Next, Jack pulled out a small collar, its leather worn and frayed at the edges. He didn't need to look closely to see the tag. It was a dog's collar. But what struck him was the name etched onto the metal plate, Max. The same name as the dog that had brought him the bag. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The dog had been carrying the bag for a reason. It wasn't just some random stray. It was a part of something. Something far bigger than Jack could have ever imagined. But the strangest thing of all was the last item in the bag, a small, crumpled piece of paper, folded into quarters. Jack unfolded it slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The handwriting was frantic, rushed, as if someone had written it in a hurry, desperate for help. The words were scrawled in black ink. Please, someone help us. She's gone. Max is all I have left. He's the only one who can help her. If you find this, please don't ignore it. Don't let them take him too. Emily needs him. The message sent a chill down Jack's spine. Who was Emily? Why was she in trouble? And what did this dog have to do with it? The words were a plea for help. But from who? And what was Jack supposed to do with this information? The truck rumbled on through the storm. But Jack felt as if the world had shifted beneath him. He had no idea who had left this message or why. But the urgency in the note was undeniable. There was something wrong. Something that had begun with the dog. But was much bigger than just a lost puppy in a snowstorm. He glanced at the dog again. Its golden eyes still fixed on him. The collar still resting beside it. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had a decision to make. He could keep driving, keep going as he always had, and leave the mystery behind. Or he could follow the strange pull that had brought him here. Follow the trail of the dog and the message in the bag. And see where it led. Something told him that whatever this was, it was more than just a simple encounter on a lonely road. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous, and far more important, than he could have ever imagined. With a deep breath, Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter. He wasn't sure what he was getting into. But it was too late to turn back now. The storm outside howled louder. But Jack's mind was already made up. He wasn't alone anymore, and wherever this road would take him, he wasn't going to face it by himself. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had brought him more than just the lost puppy. The weight of the photograph and the frantic plea for help in the crumpled note gnawed at him, tugging at something deep inside. He had never been one to dive into mysteries or search for answers to things that didn't concern him. His life was simple: drive, sleep, repeat. But something about this situation felt different. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was something bigger, something that had been set into motion long before he had pulled into that truck stop. Sitting in the warmth of his truck, Jack couldn't help but glance over at the dog. Its golden eyes were steady, almost as if it knew exactly what was going through Jack's mind. The dog hadn't barked, hadn't made a sound since the bag had been opened. It just watched Jack with a quiet intensity that sent a chill down his spine. It was as if the dog was waiting for him to make the next move. To take the next step in whatever strange, tangled web he had just stumbled into. Jack took a deep breath and reached for his phone. He knew that if he was going to make sense of the photograph and the note, he needed to know more about the girl, Emily Harper. He had to understand what had happened to her, to figure out why the dog had been carrying this mysterious message. He tapped the screen, pulling up the search engine and typing in the name, Emily Harper missing. The results came quickly, each article more grim than the last. The first headline read, "Search for missing girl. Emily Harper expands after parents found murdered." Jack's stomach dropped as he clicked on the link. The article detailed a tragedy that had rocked the small town of Maple Grove just 2 weeks earlier. Emily Harper, a bright and cheerful 7-year-old, had vanished without a trace from her home. Her parents, Thomas and Rachel Harper, were found dead in their home just hours after the disappearance. The police had no leads, no suspects, just a string of unanswered questions. The article mentioned the police's belief that Emily's abduction and her parents' murder were connected, though they hadn't been able to link any solid evidence. The police were searching for any clues, any connection to the girl's disappearance, but so far, the case was at a standstill. Jack's eyes scanned the text, his mind racing as he read more. Emily's family had been well known in the town, and her parents were described as kind, hard-working individuals. The murder had shocked the community, and the idea that their daughter could be involved in such a horrific event was unthinkable. Yet the fact that Emily was missing, and her parents were dead, painted a disturbing picture of a family torn apart in the most violent way. Jack clicked on another link, which led him to a police report. The report mentioned the presence of a black bag found near the scene of the crime, an identical description to the one the puppy had been carrying. The coincidence was enough to make Jack's skin crawl. He wasn't sure what it meant, but something told him that the dog and the bag were directly connected to Emily's disappearance. He leaned back in his seat, his mind reeling. The more he read, the clearer it became. Emily Harper was at the heart of this. And the dog, Max, was somehow tied to her. It wasn't just a stray. It wasn't just some random dog. It had a purpose. It had been carrying that bag for a reason. And now it was up to Jack to figure out what that reason was. But the question still remained. How was the dog involved in all of this? And why had it found its way to him, of all people? On that stormy night, Jack had never been one to believe in fate. But there was something about this situation that made him wonder. Was it just a coincidence that he had stopped at the truck stop? Or was he meant to be here, involved in this strange puzzle? He thought back to the note. The one scrawled in frantic handwriting. Pleading for help. Please, someone help us. She's gone. Max is all I have left. He's the only one who can help her. If you find this, please don't ignore it. Don't let them take him too. Emily needs him. Jack couldn't get those words out of his head. They haunted him, echoing in the quiet of the truck cabin. The more Jack thought about it, the more he felt a sense of urgency growing inside him. If Emily was truly in danger, if the dog was the key to finding her, then he had to act. He couldn't just drive away. Pretend he hadn't seen the note or the photograph. This wasn't something he could walk away from. He checked the weather on his phone again. The storm was still raging. And visibility was getting worse. But Jack knew he couldn't sit here any longer. He had to move. He had to find out where this trail led. Even if it took him to the heart of danger. For all he knew, the people who had taken Emily were still out there. And they might be closer than he thought. Jack started the truck and slowly pulled back onto the road. The wind howled against the cab. And the snow seemed to be falling harder now. The flakes swirling in thick, angry clouds. The headlights barely pierced the storm. And the road ahead was barely visible. But Jack's focus was razor sharp. He wasn't thinking about the storm. He wasn't thinking about how dangerous this was. He was thinking about Emily. About the note. About the dog. The dog sat quietly in the passenger seat, its head resting on the armrest, eyes half closed. It seemed to sense that Jack had made up his mind. As the truck rolled down the road, Jack thought back to the picture of Emily, her bright smile frozen in time. He could almost hear the sound of her laughter, as if it was still echoing through the empty cabin. He could see her face, so innocent and full of hope. And it was impossible not to feel a deep, aching need to find her. The storm showed no signs of letting up. The snow continued to fall in thick, unrelenting sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing, wrapping the truck in a cocoon of white. Jack had no idea where he was going, or what he would find at the end of this road. But one thing was certain. He couldn't turn back now. Whatever was out there, whatever mystery he had just stepped into, it was too late to back out. Jack drove on, the storm around him raging in full force. But inside his mind, there was only one thing that mattered: finding Emily Harper. And uncovering the truth behind the strange chain of events that had begun with a puppy, a torn bag, and a note for help. The drive to Chicago felt like a blur of white. The storm had only intensified, and the roads had become treacherous, barely passable in places. The wind howled like a wild animal, scraping against the truck's metal frame, and the snow piled up in drifts that seemed to have no end. But Jack kept his eyes on the road, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. There was no turning back now. He had made his decision, and he was committed. The puppy, now named Max, sat beside him in the passenger seat, calm and steady despite the raging storm outside. Jack had always thought of himself as a loner, someone who could handle anything on his own. But Max had changed that. The little dog had become his companion in the strangest of ways. As if it knew exactly what Jack needed. Even when Jack didn't fully understand it himself. Max's quiet presence had brought a sense of comfort. A steadying force in the chaos that seemed to be closing in around Jack. Jack had told himself he was just going to investigate. Just going to find out more about Emily and her disappearance. He wasn't expecting to get involved any deeper than that. But as the miles stretched on, the feeling that he was walking into something much larger, much darker, began to grow. The note, the photograph, the dead parents, it all pointed to something sinister. Something that didn't just involve a missing girl. He had no idea what he was really getting into. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. By the time Jack reached the outskirts of Chicago, the storm had begun to taper off, leaving the city blanketed in a heavy silence. He parked his truck in a quiet part of the city, away from the hustle and bustle, in a place where no one would think to look for him. His first stop was a diner he knew well, one that had been a favorite of truckers for years. It was a safe place. A neutral ground where he could gather his thoughts and plan his next move. Jack sat in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee as he stared out the window. The storm had subsided, but the sense of unease had only grown stronger. Something was off. He had checked into a cheap motel nearby. But it didn't take long before he realized that he wasn't the only one in town looking for answers. There were eyes on him. Watching him from the shadows. He could feel it in his gut. A creeping sensation that he couldn't shake. Someone was following him. At first, it was subtle, just a passing glance. A figure lingering in the background. But as Jack moved through the streets, as he tried to dig deeper into the mystery of Emily Harper, the feeling intensified. Every time he turned a corner, he would spot a shadow moving just out of his sight. Every time he entered a building, the door would creak, and he would hear footsteps behind him. It was as if someone, or something, was making sure he didn't get too close to the truth. Jack was no rookie. He'd spent years on the road, traveling alone, and he knew when he was being watched. He had seen the signs before. The way a person stood too still. The way they lingered just a little too long. The way the hair on the back of your neck stood up when you sensed danger. And right now, Jack felt that hair standing on end. He finished his coffee and stood up, glancing around the diner one last time. Max, who had been lying quietly in the seat next to him, looked up at Jack with those calm, golden eyes. The dog had been eerily quiet, almost as if it knew what was happening. Jack reached down to pet the dog's head, his fingers brushing through the soft fur. "All right, boy," Jack muttered under his breath. "Let's see what we can dig up." He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way to the motel where he was staying. But as he crossed the street, he caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. A black sedan was parked just a few cars down from his truck. The windows were tinted, but Jack could see the outline of a figure sitting inside, watching him. He didn't need to see their face to know they were keeping an eye on him. He had been in enough situations like this to recognize the telltale signs. Jack didn't hesitate. He made a quick decision. His instincts kicking in. He didn't want to get into a confrontation. Not now. Not yet. He turned on his heel and headed in the opposite direction, hoping to shake off whoever was tailing him. He ducked into a side street, his footsteps muffled by the snow, and glanced over his shoulder. The sedan was still there, still watching. The figure hadn't moved. Max, walking faithfully by his side, seemed to sense the tension. Jack wasn't sure how, but the dog's body language had changed. It was as if Max understood that something dangerous was lurking. Something that wasn't just a storm or a case of missing persons. Jack quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of danger. He knew that whatever was happening, It wasn't going to be easy to unravel. The deeper he went, the more complicated the mystery became. But now, it wasn't just about Emily anymore. It was about survival. Jack had made his decision to investigate. And now there was no turning back. He couldn't go home, not until he knew the truth. Not until he figured out what had really happened to Emily Harper. And why it was so dangerous for him to get involved. He continued walking, his thoughts racing. Whoever was following him wasn't going to let him get away easily. They knew he was close to something. And they would stop at nothing to keep him from uncovering it. Jack's hand instinctively went to the pocket where he kept his gun. It was a comforting weight. But he hoped he wouldn't have to use it. Not yet. Max barked once, low and sharp, breaking Jack's thoughts. He turned around just in time to see the sedan start its engine. Slowly pulling out of the parking spot. Jack's pulse quickened. They were coming. They weren't going to let him get away that easily. Jack glanced down at Max. His decision solidifying. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He had come this far. And he wasn't going to back down now. If he had to face whatever was out there, whatever danger was lurking, he would do it head on. But he wasn't alone anymore. Max was with him. And together, they would find out the truth. The tension in the air felt like a live wire, humming with electricity. Jack had barely had time to process the strange series of events when it happened. The feeling of being watched had escalated into something more menacing. And Jack knew, without a doubt, that he was getting closer to something dangerous. The mystery of Emily Harper's disappearance had led him into deeper waters. Waters that were murky and full of sharks. And now, he was right in the middle of it. The night was bitterly cold. The kind of chill that crept into your bones and made you shiver even when you weren't standing outside. Jack had parked his truck in a dimly lit area, just outside a dilapidated building that he had been investigating for the past few hours. He had learned that this place, this nondescript warehouse on the edge of Chicago, was somehow connected to a shadowy organization called Darkwood Industries. The more he dug, the more troubling the facts became. Darkwood Industries wasn't just a corporate entity, it was something far darker. Far more insidious. They were involved in illegal activities. And Jack had uncovered whispers of their involvement in the kidnapping of children. The connection to Emily Harper was growing clearer with each passing hour. And Jack couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting closer to a truth that was both horrifying and dangerous. As Jack sat in the truck, Max curled up beside him in the passenger seat. His body pressed against the warmth of the heater. Jack stared out the windshield. His mind racing. He had to keep pushing. Keep following the trail, no matter how many warning signs there were. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. But as he sat there, a creeping sense of unease gnawed at him. It wasn't just the usual feeling of being watched. It was something more. Something tangible. There was a presence out there, closing in on him. Jack glanced at his rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights approaching from behind. Moving too steadily, too deliberately. It wasn't just another car passing by. Someone was following him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He couldn't afford to panic. Not now, not when he was so close. Before he could react, the truck doors suddenly swung open with a violent force. Jack had barely time to raise his arm in defense before two figures were inside. One of them grabbing him by the collar and yanking him violently from his seat. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled against the strength of the strangers. The two men were dressed in dark clothing, their faces obscured by masks. But their intentions were unmistakable. They weren't here to talk. One of the men slammed Jack against the dashboard, causing the truck to shake. The other grabbed Max, pulling the little dog from the passenger seat and forcing him onto the floor. "Get the bag," the man in the front growled. His voice was low and gravelly, filled with malice. Now, the man behind Jack shoved him back into the seat, and Jack's vision blurred for a moment. He could taste blood in his mouth, the sharp tang of it stinging his tongue. He wasn't going down without a fight. "Who the hell are you?" Jack spat, his voice hoarse but defiant. The man in the front didn't answer. Instead, he reached past Jack, his gloved hand grabbing the black bag. The same bag that had started it all. The one Max had carried into the truck days ago. The man yanked it out of the seat, ripping it from its resting place. "Stay out of this," the man snarled, glaring at Jack with an icy fury. "You don't know what you're messing with." Jack's heart raced as the reality of the situation hit him. They were after the bag. Whatever was inside it, whatever secret it held, was more valuable to these people than anything else. He had no idea what was inside, but it was clear they weren't going to let him walk away with it. The man held the bag in his hand, his eyes narrowing as he carefully unzipped it. The tension in the truck was palpable. Jack's hands clenched into fists, his body aching with the need to take action. But the two men were too strong, too quick. He knew he wasn't going to overpower them. At least not yet. The man reached inside, pulling out the photograph of Emily Harper, the dog's collar, and the handwritten note. He held them up in front of Jack's face, his eyes scanning the items with a mix of disgust and urgency. "You've gone too far," the man said, his voice low. "You should have left well enough alone." Jack's eyes flicked to the photograph. Emily's innocent face stared back at him, a stark reminder of why he couldn't back down. The note, which had been his first clue, now seemed like a lifeline, something that tied everything together, something that held the key to understanding what was going on. But in the hands of these men, it was just another piece of evidence to be destroyed. "Who are you people?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking with anger. "What the hell is Darkwood Industries?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he carefully folded the items back into the bag and zipped it up. He looked at Jack with cold, calculating eyes, then nodded to his partner. "Let's go," the man said, his voice hard. "He's not worth the trouble. But if you don't stop, if you don't walk away from this, we'll make sure you regret it." Before Jack could react, the men were out of the truck, slamming the doors behind them. The sound of their footsteps echoed in the silence as they disappeared into the night. Jack sat in the truck, panting, his hands still clenched into fists. Max, now trembling at his feet, let out a soft whimper. Jack didn't move at first. His mind was racing, his thoughts tumbling over each other. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. Whatever was in that bag, whatever Darkwood Industries was hiding, it was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. And these men, they were just the tip of the iceberg. As the truck engine roared to life, Jack's resolve hardened. He wasn't going to be intimidated. He wasn't going to let them win. He was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was unfolding around him. The loss of the bag was a blow, but it didn't stop him. It was only a setback, a temporary obstacle. What was inside that bag, what it contained, was far too important to let slip away so easily. Emily's face, the young girl he had never met but whose fate had inexplicably become tied to his, haunted him every second. The photograph of her and the handwritten note had been ripped from his grasp, but he could still see the image of her clear blue eyes staring back at him, full of innocence and fear. The message on the note, "Help me. They won't stop until I'm gone," echoed in his mind as he drove through the night. He had learned enough to know that Emily was only a small part of a much larger, darker story, and Jack wasn't about to walk away from it. Not when he was so close. His breath fogged the windshield as he drove through the endless stretch of highway. The snow still falling heavily outside. Chicago was behind him now. And although the landscape had become more desolate, Jack knew there was a place he had to reach. A place he'd read about in some of the notes he had picked up during his investigation. A warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was abandoned, long forgotten by the world. But Jack had a hunch that this was the key to understanding everything. Darkwood Industries. The name had been mentioned repeatedly by the people who had tried to warn him. The men who had taken the bag. But they were gone now. And so was the bag. All Jack had left were the clues. And he would follow them to the end. The night seemed endless. The hours passed in a blur of snow-covered roads and darkened towns. And Jack barely registered the ache in his muscles or the exhaustion creeping up on him. He couldn't afford to stop now. Not when he was so close. He thought about Emily, her parents, the children who had gone missing over the past few months, and the horror that lurked in the shadows of this so-called organization. His grip tightened on the steering wheel as he passed mile marker after mile marker. Trying to ignore the gnawing fear that seemed to settle deeper into his gut with every passing minute. Finally, he reached the warehouse. The building stood in stark contrast to the snowy landscape around it. A dark silhouette against the pale backdrop of winter. The windows were boarded up. The doors rusted and barely hanging on their hinges. A small, faded sign with the words, Darkwood Industries, was barely visible in the snow. As if it were trying to erase its own name from existence. Jack parked his truck a few yards away, cutting the engine and stepping into the biting cold. Max, as always, followed him closely, his small body shaking from the cold but determined to stay by his side. They approached the warehouse cautiously, Jack's senses alert to every sound, every movement in the night. The wind howled through the broken windows of the structure, a low moan that seemed almost like a warning. Jack didn't care. The warehouse held answers, and he was going to find them. The door creaked loudly as Jack pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. He winced at the sound but continued inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The interior of the warehouse was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of mildew. Broken crates and old machinery were scattered haphazardly across the floor, remnants of a once bustling operation now abandoned. It looked like no one had been here in years. But Jack knew better. There was something here, something that could tell him what had happened to Emily, and to the other children who had disappeared without a trace. He moved deeper into the warehouse, Max trailing behind him, sniffing at the air as though he could sense the unease that had settled over Jack. The place was eerily quiet. The only sounds the scrape of Jack's boots on the concrete and the occasional whimper from Max. Jack didn't want to believe it, but he felt the presence of someone, or something, lurking in the shadows. He quickened his pace, the adrenaline of his pursuit pushing him forward, ignoring the warning bells that were going off in his mind. At the far end of the warehouse, he spotted a set of stairs leading to an upper level. The railing was rusted, and the steps creaked under his weight. But Jack climbed up anyway. When he reached the top, he found himself in a small room that was different from the rest of the warehouse. This room was relatively clean, and there were papers scattered across the desk. Papers that seemed to have been recently disturbed. Jack's heart began to race as he approached the desk, the faint glow of his flashlight illuminating the documents. There, among the papers, was something that caught his eye, another photograph. This one was of a young girl, no older than 6 or 7, with dark brown hair and sad eyes. He recognized her face immediately. It was Emily, the same girl from the photograph he had seen days ago. But this photograph was different. It had a date on the back. 2 weeks ago. Jack's hands trembled as he turned the photograph over. There was something written on the back, in the same handwriting as the note from the bag. They're taking us, one by one. Help us. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry as dust. The realization hit him with a gut-wrenching force. Emily had been taken. She had been here, in this very building, and she had left behind a trail for someone to follow. For him to follow. He turned to look around the room, his eyes scanning the rest of the documents on the desk. There were lists, names, and dates, more children, all gone missing, and behind them, always, was the name, Darkwood Industries. This was their operation. This was their sick, twisted game, and it was happening right here. But before he could gather more information, Jack heard something, a noise, a shuffle of footsteps outside the room. Someone was coming. He quickly stuffed the photograph into his jacket and moved toward the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. His heart was pounding in his chest. And Max, sensing the change in Jack's mood, growled low in his throat. The door creaked open just as Jack ducked behind a stack of crates. His breath shallow and rapid. He barely had time to adjust before a shadow passed by the door. A figure moving swiftly in the direction of the stairs. Jack held his breath, waiting. Whoever it was, they hadn't noticed him, but he knew now. He was being hunted. Darkwood Industries was real, and they were going to do everything they could to make sure the truth stayed buried. Jack's hand tightened around the photograph in his jacket. This was no longer just about Emily. It was about exposing a monstrous organization that would stop at nothing to protect its secrets. Jack wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stepped further into the darkness of the warehouse. His breath was shallow, almost as if his lungs couldn't process the air around him. Each step echoed in the hollow silence. The heavy weight of the truth pressing down on him. The photograph of Emily was still clenched tightly in his hand. And as he moved deeper into the space, he felt like he was walking through a nightmare where the faces of innocent children stared back at him from the shadows. The warehouse had always seemed abandoned, forgotten, a relic of a bygone era. But as Jack ventured farther into its depths, he began to see that it had been far from forgotten. It had been a holding ground, a place where the unseen hands of Darkwood Industries had kept their horrific secrets. Well hidden from the world, the walls of the warehouse were covered with faded posters and documents. Some of them still legible, others too aged to make out. But it wasn't the documents that drew Jack's attention now. It was the sound, a soft, whimpering sound. Almost imperceptible but unmistakable. His eyes widened in shock as he followed the noise. Moving quickly yet cautiously, the sound was coming from behind a large set of metal doors at the back of the warehouse. Jack hesitated, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of his neck. He wasn't sure what he was about to find, but he knew it couldn't be good. He reached for the door handle, his fingers brushing against the cold steel. With a deep breath, he twisted it and pushed the door open, the hinges creaking in protest. What he found on the other side made his stomach drop. The room was smaller than he expected, but it was packed with cages. And inside those cages were children. Girls. They were dirty, their clothes ragged and torn, their faces pale and gaunt from hunger and fear. They were barely moving. Only the faintest signs of life remaining in their eyes. But it was enough. The cages rattled as Jack stepped inside, his eyes searching each face, each figure that huddled in the dim light. Emily. He found her in the far corner, her small frame curled up on the cold concrete floor. She was unconscious, her breathing shallow, but Jack could see the faint rise and fall of her chest. His heart clenched, and for a moment, he forgot everything else, the danger, the risk, the organization that had caused so much pain. It was just her. He had to get her out of here. But as he approached her, a voice rang out from the darkness behind him. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Jack froze, his body tensing. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows, his mind racing. A tall man emerged from the darkness, his face obscured by the low light. He was wearing a black suit, his posture rigid and controlled. Jack's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stayed where he was, unwilling to let go of the chance to save these children, unwilling to turn his back on the nightmare he had uncovered. The man smiled, but it wasn't a smile of kindness. It was a smile that dripped with malice and control. Darkwood Industries has been operating for years. Mr. Thompson, you should have stayed out of this. But now that you've found your way here, I suppose it's too late for you. Jack's grip tightened around the photograph in his hand. Who are you? What are you doing to these children? The man's smile widened. We do what's necessary, Mr. Thompson. We create the future, one way or another. These girls, they're the next generation. They're valuable to us. They've been chosen. Jack's blood ran cold as the man continued, his words laced with venom. You see, Darkwood Industries isn't just about business. It's about control, and every piece, every child, every person who walks through our doors is part of the bigger plan. The future will belong to those who can control it, and we're ensuring that we do. Jack's mind reeled with what the man was saying. Control? These children weren't pawns in some game, they were lives. Stolen from their families, kept in cages. He could feel the bile rise in his throat, the weight of the truth crashing down on him. Why do you do this? Jack demanded, his voice low, but filled with fury. The man's eyes gleamed with cold amusement. Because we can, Mr. Thompson. Because power doesn't come from standing in the shadows. It comes from making the shadows work for you. These girls, they're just the beginning. We have plans for many more. And you're too late to stop us. Jack's mind raced, his pulse quickening. He glanced at the children again, their hollow eyes following him, some of them too weak to lift their heads. This was bigger than Emily. This was a network of horrors, a factory of stolen futures. And it stretched far beyond this warehouse. The children were nothing more than tools in a twisted, monstrous agenda. Suddenly, Jack's gaze fell on something near the back of the room, another table. This one with documents scattered across it. He moved toward it, his eyes scanning the papers quickly. There were records of other missing children. Names, dates, and places. But there was something else, a plan. A blueprint for the next phase of Darkwood Industries operations. Jack's hands shook as he sifted through the pages, his heart racing. The plan was far-reaching, too far-reaching. It wasn't just about children. It was about manipulating the future, shaping society to fit the organization's vision. And they weren't just targeting vulnerable children. They were planning to infiltrate governments, businesses, and families, using these children as pawns in a scheme that would ripple through every aspect of society. Jack couldn't believe what he was reading. These people weren't just criminals, they were revolutionaries. In their own sick way. He turned to face the man, his voice steady but filled with a cold fury. This ends now. The man laughed, the sound echoing off the walls. You think you can stop us? You're just one man. Jack Thompson. You can't fight the machine. It's too big. It's too powerful. But Jack wasn't intimidated. He knew now what he had to do. He wasn't leaving this warehouse without Emily. Without the evidence that could bring down Darkwood Industries. And he wasn't going to let these monsters get away with it. Not while he still had breath in his lungs. As Jack moved to gather Emily in his arms, he heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the entrance. The man's voice dropped, low and threatening. You'll regret this, Mr. Thompson. No one escapes us. But Jack didn't care. Not anymore. He had uncovered the truth. And that was all that mattered. Now, he was going to make sure everyone else knew it too. The tension in the air was suffocating. Jack's every sense was on high alert as he stood in the heart of the warehouse. Emily in his arms, and the weight of the children's future pressing down on him. The man who had confronted him earlier, the one who spoke with such chilling confidence, was nowhere to be seen. But Jack knew better than to think this was over. He could feel it, the quiet before the storm. The moment of reckoning was fast approaching. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor behind him, and Jack's grip tightened around Emily. He had to move quickly. He glanced around the room. The children were still in their cages, helpless and vulnerable, but not for long. His mind raced, trying to find the quickest way out. But then he heard a voice from the darkness, cold and mocking. "You can't escape us, Thompson. Not now, not ever." It was the man again, his voice echoing through the metal walls like a phantom. Jack's heart raced, but he didn't falter. He had come too far to back down now. He couldn't let them win, not after everything he had seen, everything he had learned. Turning to Emily, he whispered, "Stay close. We're getting out of here." The little girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, her tiny fingers clutching onto his jacket. Jack moved toward the back exit, his mind calculating his next move. He had a few minutes, maybe less, before the men from Darkwood Industries would be on him, trying to put an end to this. He had to get Emily to safety. He had to free the other children. He heard them now, the sound of footsteps growing louder, the sinister voices of the men who would stop at nothing to protect their operation. Jack knew he couldn't face them head-on, not without help. Not without the resources he needed. But help came in unexpected forms. The little golden retriever that had started it all, the dog that had brought him into this madness, was there. Darting between his legs, growling softly, its small body tense with purpose. Jack didn't have time to question it. He knelt down, placing a hand on the dog's head. "We're in this together," he whispered. The dog barked once, as if to say, "Let's do this." Without warning, the door to the back of the warehouse burst open, and Jack saw the men, dark suits and menacing faces. There were at least 5 of them, armed and dangerous. They moved toward him with purpose, their eyes locked on their prize. Jack's pulse quickened, but he was ready. He had to fight back. Emily screamed, and the sound was like a spark in the dry wood of Jack's resolve. He pushed her behind him, shielding her with his own body. The dog was growling now, standing between Jack and the advancing men. Teeth bared. It was small, but it had a fire in its eyes that made Jack feel like they might actually have a chance. "You don't have to do this," one of the men said, his voice cold. "You're out of your league, Thompson." Jack didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He knew what he had to do. The first man lunged at him, and Jack reacted instinctively. He grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the floor nearby and swung it with all his strength, catching the man in the side. The man stumbled, but another rushed forward, grabbing Jack by the arm. The dog barked, charging at the man's legs, and he yelped in surprise. Loosening his grip, Jack twisted out of the man's hold and delivered a punch to his jaw, sending him to the ground. But there were more of them, and Jack was growing tired. He knew that if they didn't make it out soon, they wouldn't make it out at all. "Emily, get to the exit," Jack shouted, his voice strained but filled with urgency. The little girl hesitated, her eyes wide with fear, but the dog barked again, urging her on. She took off running, her small legs moving as fast as they could. Jack didn't take his eyes off the men for a second, his every movement driven by the need to protect her, to protect the children who were counting on him. Another man stepped forward, gun drawn. Jack's heart raced. He knew he didn't have much time. The man with the gun aimed it directly at him, but before he could pull the trigger, the dog leapt at him, snapping at his hand. The man's shot went wild, and Jack charged forward, tackling the man to the ground. The gun went skidding across the floor. Jack's breath was heavy, his body aching, but he wasn't about to stop now. He glanced at Emily, who was already at the door. her tiny hands pulling it open. "Go!" he shouted. The dog was right behind him, darting through the chaos with a level of determination that surprised Jack. He followed Emily to the door, where he could hear the shouts of the remaining men behind him. But they weren't fast enough. Jack made it through the door, pulling Emily and the dog with him into the cold night air. They weren't safe yet. They weren't even close. The sound of engines roaring to life echoed from the distance, and Jack knew that the men would be after them. He didn't have a plan. Not really, but he didn't need one. The night was his ally now. He pulled Emily close, and the dog trotted beside them. Its ears perked, alert. They couldn't stop. They couldn't slow down. They ran, their feet pounding against the snow-covered ground. The sounds of pursuit growing louder with each passing second. Jack's heart was in his throat, his mind spinning. He didn't know where they were going, but he knew they couldn't go back. A car appeared in the distance, headlights cutting through the darkness. It was a police vehicle, and Jack recognized the silhouette of an officer behind the wheel. The officer slowed, rolling down the window. "Are you all right?" the officer called out. Jack didn't hesitate. "Get us out of here. Now." The officer didn't question him. He hit the gas, and they sped off, leaving the chaos of Darkwood Industries behind. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, Jack felt a flicker of hope. The fight wasn't over, but at least he had the truth now. He had the children, he had Emily, and the world would know what Darkwood Industries had done. But the hardest part was yet to come. Jack knew that the truth wasn't always enough to bring justice. But he also knew this: as long as there were people who cared, as long as there were those who would fight, there was hope, and that was all that mattered now.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.